My daughter, I'm so sorry.
The bourbon was good. That was the first thing Arthur Sterling noticed when he settled into the corner booth of Grady's roadside diner, 47 miles outside his judicial district, far enough from the courthouse steps and the congratulatory handshakes that he could finally breathe. The second thing he noticed was that the vinyl seat was torn, the laminated menu was sticky at the edges, and the overhead light above his table buzzed with the persistence of a man who did not know when to stop talking. None of it bothered him. After 22 years on the bench, Judge Arthur Sterling had learned that a man who only ate in fine restaurants was a man who had forgotten where real power lived. Power lived in places exactly like this, unglamorous, honest, and entirely indifferent to his $3,000 suit. His clerk, Dennis, sat across from him, nursing a coffee and reviewing the morning conviction summary on his tablet with the quiet efficiency Arthur had come to depend on. The Calloway case. 12 counts. Unanimous verdict. The kind of landmark ruling that would carry Arthur's name into law school textbooks for the next decade, and he knew it, though he would never say so out loud. He raised his bourbon glass in a quiet, private toast to no one in particular. That was when his right hand trembled. It was brief, a small, involuntary shake that traveled from his wrist to the tips of his fingers and vanished before Dennis could look up. Arthur set the glass down carefully and pressed his palm flat against the table. He had been doing that for months now, pressing his hands against flat surfaces to quiet them, the way a man presses his palm over a crack in a wall and tells himself the foundation is fine. His physician had a name for what was happening. Arthur had chosen not to repeat that name out loud even once, because nomming a thing gave it gravity, and Arthur Sterling did not grant gravity to anything he had not yet decided to confront. He exhaled slowly. He picked up the menu. He was a man in complete control of everything around him. Then a glass shattered. The sound cracked through the low hum of the diner like a gavel strike, and Arthur's eyes moved to the source on pure instinct, the reflex of a man who had spent decades reading a room before the room knew it was being read. A waitress stood 3 booths away, one hand pressed over her mouth, a broken tumbler at her feet, ice scattering across the linoleum in every direction. She was already turning away, crouching down, reaching for the pieces before anyone could study her face. But Arthur had already seen it. The line of her jaw, the way she pulled her lower lip between her teeth when she was frightened, her mother's eyes. Before you find out what happened next, take a moment to hit like, subscribe, and drop a comment below. Where are you watching from today? Wherever you are in the world, please take care of yourself and the people around you. This is a work of fiction, crafted to explore the weight of justice, pride, and love, but the truth inside it is real. Now, let us continue. Arthur did not move from his booth. He set the menu down with the precision of a man diffusing something fragile and watched her navigate the diner floor. Her movements were slow and deliberate, weighted by 8 months of pregnancy that had clearly not been easy on her body. Her ankles were swollen above the worn edges of her non-slip shoes. Her apron was stained at the hem. Her hair was pulled back in the efficient, joyless way of a woman who had long stopped doing it for anyone but pure practicality. The name tag pinned to her chest read Maggie. Her name was not Maggie. Arthur's jaw tightened until he felt it in his back teeth. He had disowned Alina Sterling 14 months ago in the marble foyer of his own home, with Cynthia standing at the top of the staircase, and a legal document laid flat on the table between them. $500,000 missing from his campaign fund. A forensic audit trail that pointed directly to Alina's accounts. A signed confession he had read 3 times before folding it and handing it to his attorney without once looking at his daughter's face again. He had not spoken her name since. He had instructed Cynthia, his chief of staff Randall, and Dennis each in turn that Alina Sterling was no longer a topic of conversation in any room he occupied. He picked up the leather billfold holding his check and placed it at the edge of the table. Dennis glanced up. Arthur said nothing. He waited. Alina came back around on her rotation, refilling water glasses at the neighboring booth without lifting her eyes. She was good at that, practiced at keeping her gaze down, and her face turned at just enough of an angle to avoid direct recognition. Arthur understood it was not shyness. A man who had spent over 2 decades studying witnesses from an elevated bench knew the precise difference between a person who was timid and a person who was deliberately invisible. One was a personality. The other was a survival strategy. When she reached the edge of his table, he said her name. Not with the full-room authority he could have summoned. Not with the cold judicial weight he had deployed against defendants who thought they could hide truth from him. He said it quietly, the way a man speaks when he is not entirely sure the ground beneath him will hold. "Sit down, Alina." She stopped, her grip tightened around the water pitcher. She did not turn around. The diner carried on its noise around them, cutlery against plates, low conversation, the buzzing overhead light above his booth. Dennis had gone perfectly still. Arthur kept his eyes on the back of his daughter's neck and waited with the patience of a man who had long ago learned that silence pulls more truth out of a room than any question ever could. Then Alina turned. She looked at him the way a person looks at the thing they have spent months rehearsing for and still cannot fully prepare for when it arrives. Her lips parted. Her free hand moved to her belly without thinking, automatic and instinctive, the way it probably did 100 times every day now. "They're killing you too, Dad," she whispered. Her knees gave way. Arthur was out of the booth before the water pitcher hit the floor, crossing the distance between them in 3 steps, catching his daughter with both hands. The same hands that had trembled over a bourbon glass 20 minutes ago, now steadier than they had been in months, and pulling her weight against his chest, while the diner erupted around them with the noise of concerned strangers rising from their seats. He stood there in his $3,000 suit, in a roadside diner 47 miles from his courthouse, holding the daughter he had condemned, her 8-month belly pressed firmly against him, her last 4 words still dissolving in the air above them, both like smoke from something already burning. The bourbon sat untouched on the table behind him. The landmark conviction and everything that came with it were already a lifetime ago. The back office of Grady's roadside diner was barely large enough to hold a metal folding chair, a stack of linen supply boxes, and the weight of everything Alina Sterling had been carrying alone for 14 months. A single bear bulb hung from the ceiling. The room smelled of industrial detergent and old cardboard. Arthur had commandeered it without asking, simply walked the diner manager to the door with the quiet authority of a man who did not require permission to occupy a space. And the manager had nodded and stepped aside the way most people stepped aside for Arthur Sterling without fully understanding why. Alina sat in the folding chair with a damp cloth pressed against the back of her neck, her breathing steadied now, her color returning in slow degrees. Dennis had gone to his car without being told. The door was shut. It was just the two of them for the first time in over a year, and the silence between them had the texture of something that had been sealed shut for so long that opening it required a kind of violence neither of them was ready to name. Arthur stood with his arms crossed and his back against the metal shelving because there was nowhere else to stand, and he waited. He was good at waiting. He had made a career of it. Alina looked up at him. She searched his face the way she used to when she was small and trying to determine whether he was the kind of angry that required an apology or the kind that required silence. Then she began to talk. She did not steal the money. She said it plainly, without decoration, without the trembling performance of someone trying to be believed. She said it the way a person states a fact they have lived inside for so long that it no longer requires emphasis. The $500,000 had moved through her accounts because someone who had access to her laptop and her banking credentials had moved it there, then moved it out again before she had any reason to look. She had been in Arthur's courthouse parking garage on a Tuesday evening in January, walking to her car after delivering campaign documents to Randall's office, when 2 men she had never seen before put her in the back of a black SUV and drove for 3 hours without speaking a word. Arthur's expression did not shift. His jaw was set. His eyes were steady. He had the controlled, surgical stillness of a man absorbing testimony he intended to act on, not react to. She described a room. She described a document slid across a table with a pen laid on top of it. She described a voice telling her that the confession was already complete and that her role was only to make it official. She described signing, because one of the men had placed his phone on the table and shown her a photograph of Arthur taken that same morning, leaving his home, and the voice had said with complete calm that the call to correct that could be made before she finished the drive home. She was released at a bus station outside Louisville, Kentucky, with $200 in cash, no phone, and a warning she had believed every single day since. Arthur uncrossed his arms. He pressed one palm flat against the shelf beside him. He believed her. He believed her not because she was his daughter, and not because he wanted to, but because he had spent 22 years listening to people tell the truth and listening to people construct the architecture of a lie, and those were two entirely different sounds. What Alina was giving him right now had no architecture. It was just the raw, unadorned shape of something that had happened. He reached into his jacket pocket and removed his morning pill case. He did it without drama, turning the small plastic container over once in his fingers. Cynthia had introduced the supplements 18 months ago, presenting them across the breakfast table with the gentle authority of a woman who had decided that managing Arthur's health was simply another item on her list of contributions to his life. A specialist she trusted, she had said, custom formulated. He had taken them every morning since because he was a man who prided himself on discipline. And discipline included the boring maintenance of a body he intended to keep functional for as long as the work required it. Alina's eyes dropped to the pill case and stayed there. She told him about her obstetrician, a quiet, thorough woman who had practiced forensic toxicology for 11 years before moving to prenatal care, and who had listened to Alina describe Arthur's symptoms one evening in the examination room. The tremors, the occasional cognitive fog, the episodes of dizziness that Arthur had told no one about, but that Alina had heard about through Randall in the months before she disappeared. And who had gone very still in the way that medical professionals go still when something in a patient's description crosses a threshold they recognize. Progressive lead microdosing, Alina said, slow enough to present as early-onset neurological decline, consistent enough over 18 months to be permanent within another year if uninterrupted. Arthur stood in the back office of a roadside diner and said nothing for a long time. Then he took out his phone and made a call. He spoke for 40 seconds. He gave an address and a time and a single instruction. The call ended. He put the phone away and placed the pill case on the supply shelf beside him, as though setting down a piece of evidence in a case that had just been elevated to the highest priority on his docket. He did not raise his voice. He did not curse. He did not tell Alina how he felt about any of it, because there would be time for that later, and the present moment required something other than feeling. The diner's back door opened. The man who stepped through it was not Grady's staff. He was broad across the shoulders, dressed plainly in a way that was specifically designed not to attract attention, and his eyes moved to Alina before they moved to anything else in the room. That single detail told Arthur everything he needed to know about the man's purpose. Private security with a specific assignment did not scan a room the way law enforcement did. They found the target first and assessed the obstacle second. Arthur was the obstacle. What happened in the next 90 seconds was not elegant. It was not the kind of thing Arthur Sterling had ever imagined doing in a suit he had paid $3,000 for. But the 6 years he had spent as a police reservist before law school had deposited something in his muscle memory that 22 years behind a bench had not fully erased, and that something surfaced now with the cold efficiency of a reflex that had simply been waiting for a reason. The man left through the same door he had entered. He left without Alina. He left considerably less composed than he had arrived. Arthur stood in the center of the small room, breathing evenly, his left forearm carrying a dull, deep ache from a collision with the door frame that he noted and set aside. He straightened his jacket. He looked at Alina, who was gripping both armrests of the folding chair and staring at him with an expression he could not immediately categorize. He picked up his phone and called Dennis. "Pull everything on Cynthia's personal financials," he said, quietly, not through the office, "and find out who runs Hargrove Private Security." He ended the call. He looked at his daughter. The bare bulb above them buzzed with the same indifferent persistence as the light in his booth out front, and for a moment neither of them spoke, and the room held the specific, pressurized quiet of a situation that had moved far beyond the point where either anger or grief was the most useful response. Arthur pulled a linen supply box from the shelf, set it upright on the floor beside Alina's chair, and sat down on it. It held his weight. He looked at the pill case on the shelf and then looked at the door and then looked at his daughter's hands, still gripping the armrests, still steady despite everything, the same way his hands had gone steady when he needed them most. He said nothing yet, but he did not leave. The Sterling estate had never looked more like a stage set than it did on the night of the gala, and Arthur had never been more aware of that fact than he was now, moving through his own home as though he were a guest who had arrived slightly late and was still finding his bearings. The chandeliers threw warm gold light across 200 guests in formal attire. The catering was flawless. The floral arrangements along the main staircase were Cynthia's work, enormous and architectural, and cold in the way that beautiful things are cold when they have been assembled for effect rather than feeling. A string quartet occupied the far corner of the reception hall, playing something that no one was actually listening to. Arthur walked with his cane tonight. He had not used it in months, but he brought it out now and leaned into it with the careful, slightly bewildered gait of a man whose body was quietly losing an argument with time. He paused twice on his way through the entrance hall, once to look at a painting he had passed 1,000 times as though he were only now noticing it, and once to accept a glass of water from a passing server and then hold it without drinking, his eyes drifting across the room in the vague, untethered way that had been worrying his physician and his colleagues, and most importantly, his wife. Cynthia found him within 4 minutes. She always did. She took his free arm with both hands, her grip warm and proprietary, and steered him gently toward the center of the room with the practiced ease of a woman who had made herself indispensable to a powerful man and intended to remain so. She looked extraordinary tonight. She always looked extraordinary. Arthur had once considered that one of the many reasons he had been fortunate to find her. He considered it differently now. "You look tired, darling," she said, close enough that only he could hear her. He let his eyes find her face slowly, as though focusing required a small effort. "Just the crowd," he said. His voice came out slightly softer than usual, slightly less certain at the edges. It was a precise calibration, not enough to alarm the room, enough to confirm what Cynthia already believed she was watching. She smiled. It was a beautiful smile. Arthur noted, with the detached clarity of a man who had already made his decision, that he would probably never stop being struck by how beautiful a convincing smile could be on the wrong face. Randall materialized on his other side 20 minutes into the evening, as Arthur had known he would. His chief of staff had the social instincts of a man who monitored situations, and Arthur being upright and present at a public event was a situation Randall needed to monitor personally. He shook Arthur's hand with both of his and asked how the judge was holding up, and Arthur looked at him for just a half-second too long before answering, the way a man looks at a familiar face he is struggling to place, and watched Randall's shoulders drop a fraction of an inch with quiet satisfaction. Arthur worked the room for 90 minutes. He let Cynthia finish 2 of his sentences. He asked the federal appellate judge beside him a question he had already answered himself 3 years ago in a published opinion, and he did not correct the confusion. He accepted congratulations on the Calloway conviction with a distracted warmth that suggested he was not entirely sure what the Calloway conviction was. He was, throughout all of it, entirely sure of everything. The estate's audiovisual system was a gift Arthur had commissioned and installed himself 2 years prior, ostensibly for the home theater and the conference capability of his private study. The receiver in the main hall had a range that covered the reception room, the adjoining library, and the terrace. Dennis was parked in the service lane behind the east garden wall with a laptop, a direct feed, and instructions to capture everything cleanly. Cynthia made her most significant error on the terrace at the 90-minute mark, in the company of Randall and the estate's private attorney, when she believed the last of the guests had drifted back inside and the evening was functionally over. She was not wrong about the guests. She was wrong about the microphone positioned inside the stone planter 12 inches from where she stood. And she was wrong about Arthur. who was watching the terrace through the library window with his cane in one hand and his phone face down in his jacket pocket. She spoke for 11 minutes. Randall spoke for 4. The estate attorney said almost nothing, which in Arthur's legal estimation was going to serve him marginally better in the months ahead, though not well enough to matter. When Cynthia came to find Arthur to say goodnight to the last departing guests, he was standing exactly where she had left him, slightly unfocused, slightly diminished, leaning on his cane and holding an untouched glass of sparkling water. She kissed his cheek. He patted her hand. By 6 the following morning, the complete evidence package was in the hands of the federal prosecutor Arthur had trusted for 11 years. The supplements and their forensic analysis. The financial records Dennis had pulled on Cynthia's personal accounts, which connected cleanly to Hargrove Private Security, and to a secondary account Randall had operated under a shell structure for 22 months. The forged documents from Alina's case. The coerced confession. Recovered from the fireproof filing cabinet in Randall's home office by a private investigator Arthur had retained 6 days after leaving Grady's diner. And the recording from the terrace, clean and complete and entirely unambiguous. Arthur did not wait for the arrests. He had done what was required, and what came next belonged to the machinery of the law he had served his entire adult life. He drove back to the diner. Alina was not on shift. He found her in the back parking lot, sitting on an overturned milk crate with her shoes beside her on the asphalt, both hands working slow circles against the arch of her left foot. The morning was pale and cool, and the lot smelled of rain that had passed through hours earlier. She looked up when she heard his footsteps and did not startle, which told him she had been expecting him in the way that people expect things they have almost stopped allowing themselves to hope for. Arthur sat down beside her on a second crate without asking whether he was welcome. He reached into the interior pocket of his jacket and removed a folded document. He held it for a moment between both hands, and Alina looked at it and then looked at his face, and he saw her recognize what it was, the original confession bearing her coerced signature, the document that had replaced his daughter with a case file in his mind for 14 months. He tore it in half, then in quarters. He opened his fingers and let the pieces fall, and the pale morning air carried them a few inches across the wet asphalt before they settled. "Come home," he said. Alina looked at him for a long time. The parking lot was quiet. Somewhere past the tree line, a bird was working through the same 4 notes repeatedly, patient and unhurried. "The baby is a boy," she said finally. Her voice was careful. "I was going to name him after you." Arthur absorbed that. The morning light was thin and honest, and it landed without flattery on both of them, on his age and her exhaustion, and the 14 months that sat between the people they had been and the people they were now. "Was he said?" She almost smiled. The corner of her mouth moved in the way it always had when she was conceding something she had already decided. "Still might," she said. 3 months later, Arthur Sterling retired from the bench in a private ceremony attended by 12 people, which was exactly how he wanted it. Alina's name was cleared by federal order in the same week that Cynthia and Randall were formally indicted on charges that Arthur had no role in prosecuting and every confidence in seeing through. Every asset stripped from Cynthia in the civil proceeding that followed was redirected, by Arthur's explicit instruction, into the foundation he incorporated under his grandson's name. The foundation provided housing assistance, legal support, and medical access to single mothers across the state. It was the most useful thing Arthur Sterling had ever built, and he had built it from the wreckage of the worst judgment he had ever made. There was a nursery in the east wing of the Sterling estate. There was a name on a birth certificate that made Arthur, on the morning he first read it, press his palm flat against the kitchen table and stand very still for a long time, not to quiet a tremor. The tremors had stopped 3 weeks after the supplements did. He was simply standing there, in the way that a man stands when he has been given back something he had convinced himself he did not deserve, and has not yet decided what to do with the fullness of that.